Jake Paul believes he's saved boxing and believes Tyson Fury is afraid to fight both Anthony Joshua and Alexander Usyk, which is harming the sport. So if we scroll down and look at some quotes here, he said, "Boxing was such a dying sport before I came into it and literally saved the whole entire sport, basically single handedly, along with some other heavyweights and some lightweights. But mostly because of me, boxing was saved, and I'm starting to realize what the problem was." He goes on to say, "That's why you don't see the biggest fights. Tyson Fury is afraid to fight Joshua. Tyson Fury is afraid to fight Usyk. Why haven't Javonta and Devin Haney fought? Why haven't Javonta and Ryan Garcia fought? Why aren't these big fights happening? Because one of the parties is scared. Who knows which party it is, but this is why boxing is dying, because these fights aren't mandatory. No one can force them to do these fights like they can in UFC." All right, a few things to pick up on here. Now, when Jake Paul says he saved boxing, we have to make the distinction between boxing in the United States and boxing in other markets such as the UK. In the United States, boxing is, I would say, a niche sport for the most part. It isn't as mainstream as many other sports, and you could argue it's not even as mainstream at this point as UFC. So, has Jake Paul managed to bring a lot more attention back to the sport of boxing? And I have to say yes. Again, he acknowledged that there's been some heavyweights that have contributed to bringing more attention back to boxing and some lightweights. But he believes more than anything, it's him that has brought so much of the attention back. And he might even be right, to be honest with you. And you can say that he's not a real boxer, he's a YouTuber, and that he wouldn't be able to beat any of the top level fighters in his weight division, etc., etc. All that might be true, but it doesn't really matter. See, this is why I was always in favor of these YouTubers and social media personalities boxing, because they bring attention to the sport. People who follow these guys are then thinking, okay, boxing is the way to go. If they might want to, in fact, many of them have tried it out, right? Many of the friends of these YouTubers like KSI and the Paul brothers have also tried their hand at boxing. So I think people underestimate the positive impact it can have on the sport when these internet celebrities actually try it for themselves. So yeah, he might be right about that. He's definitely contributed to reviving boxing somewhat in the United States in terms of bringing it back into the mainstream fold in terms of the amount of attention it gets. So he might be right about that. Now, as far as what he says about the reason boxing is dying, I think there's a number of reasons why boxing in the United States isn't what it used to be back in the 90s or the 80s or the 70s. There's a whole heap of different reasons. He says one of the reasons is because the best fighters aren't fighting the best fighters. I think that, and I've mentioned this before, the perception that the UFC have managed to create is that they have all the best fighters and that the other MMA promotional outfits don't really matter in terms of the talent they have. Therefore, when they call someone the undisputed champion in UFC, it's as good as actually being the undisputed champion, even though they aren't really. You can't be the undisputed champion unless you have all the belts of all the different promotional companies in MMA. All right, being the UFC undisputed champion doesn't really mean much. Yeah, it's like saying you're the Matchroom undisputed champion. What does that mean? So, UFC have done a very good marketing job creating this perception that they are MMA and everything outside of them doesn't really matter. If you matched the top UFC champions against the champions from Bellator and various other MMA companies, you would see upsets. Maybe the UFC guys would dominate most of the time, but you would see upsets. So I do take issue with this idea of the UFC champions being undisputed. I just think it's a bit of a gimmick because fans like to hear the word undisputed, right? It bolsters the bolsters the status of a fighter in the minds of the fans when they attach this undisputed word to the fighter, even when it's not appropriate, as I've just explained. So, yeah, anyway, that's just a little side note. With regards to UFC making all the fighters face each other and it doesn't happen in boxing, well, that's true. But again, the UFC is not the entirety of MMA. It just creates the perception that the best fight the best because all the best are in UFC and you don't need to look outside of UFC. Also, of course, boxing has got so many more fighters than the UFC. The UFC have got whatever it is, a couple hundred. In boxing, you're talking about 20,000. So the pool of talent in boxing is far, far bigger. And therefore, you're not going to have all the best fighters fight the best in boxing because there are just so many top fighters with a sport that's got so many participants. You see it. And this is something that I think promoters need to do a better job of conveying to the public. The differences between boxing and UFC. And the fact that if boxing was smaller, you'd see the best fight the best more often. But because it's got so many participants, it gets more complicated. And if UFC ever gets to the size of boxing in terms of the number of participants, that's going to become more complicated as well. Now, as far as Tyson Fury specifically, what Jake Paul says here, as far as Tyson Fury being afraid to fight Joshua and Usyk, I don't think Tyson Fury is afraid to fight Joshua and Usyk. That's not the wording I would use. But I do think that Tyson Fury is cognizant of how valuable the O is, the unbeaten record in the wake of the Mayweather era. Back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, a loss wasn't the end of the world. Many great fighters came back from losses. It was Mayweather who really popularized this idea that if you've lost, then you can't even be in the conversation for the greatest fighter ever. This is what he would fire at the likes of Ray Robinson and Ali and even fighters who were around during his time like Pacquiao. Oh, they've lost fights. I've never lost. You see it. And I think Tyson Fury has taken that, and he's also taken the tactics that Mayweather used to use. And I saw some little Mayweather fanboy. I didn't even respond. When you sign into YouTube and you go to the YouTube studio, and it gives you like highlights of all the metrics and comments and all this kind of stuff on your channel. And I saw some comment from, I'm going to assume you're some little American guy. And he said that I was capping when I said that Mayweather avoided certain people. I mean, either you weren't around or you weren't paying attention enough during that era, or you're a fanboy or both. Because Mayweather avoided multiple different fights, multiple opponents. Okay? And he used the exact method that I've described. And Mayweather was a great fighter, but he was also a great manager, or at least the people behind him were great managers. The Al Haymans and what have you. Because Floyd was never a guy who would just fight anybody at any time. No. He was a guy who was careful about who he fought and when he fought them, and in certain instances, what weight he fought them at. Of course, he brought Canelo down to a catch weight. So I know Canelo offered to do it and all this kind of stuff, but he criticized Pacquiao for fighting people at catch weights, only to do the very same thing himself. So Floyd was real savvy and crafty about who he fought and when he fought them. And I think Tyson Fury is the same. In fact, he's always been the same. Why didn't he fight David Price for the British title back in the days? And people can laugh at that now and scoff at it and say, what, you saying he's avoiding David Price? The Tyson Fury of back then was getting flattened by the likes of Nevin Pikage. So when you're getting flattened by Nevin Pikage, it isn't such a stretch of the imagination to think that back then he might not have fancied the David Price fight. Bearing in mind, David Price was undefeated back then. He'd beaten Tyson Fury in the amateurs, and he was knocking everybody out in the pros up until that point. So it's not so far-fetched to think a young, green Tyson Fury or his team maybe didn't fancy that fight at that particular time. You see what I'm saying? So he did that back then, but of course tried to create the perception that David Price didn't want the fight, which was just bizarre. And he's gone on to do similar things since. Make out that AJ didn't want to fight him when Tyson Fury came back in 2018. Oh, AJ don't want to fight. It's like, what are you talking about? You were offered a deal by Eddie Hearn, which included the AJ fight, but you decided to go for the Frank Warren offer, which included a couple of pies, and then he jumped in with Deontay Wilder, who I think at the time, see, Fury says Wilder only fought him because Wilder thought that Fury was finished, and I agree with that. But at the same time, I think that Fury fought Wilder at that particular point because he felt as though Wilder was actually an easier touch than AJ. Yeah, that's my view. So, yeah, he's done this for a long time, Tyson Fury, and it's not fear. I think it's really about vanity, pride, and money with Tyson Fury. I think he wants to be the heavyweight Mayweather. He knows how to play that particular game. He would like to, if possible, retire undefeated because he wants his name up in lights. And, I mean, he's done a tremendous job in terms of marketing, in terms of PR. When you think that he's only had, 5 title fights at this point, 4 or 5 title fights, and he's got people saying that he's the greatest of all time. You've got people saying that he's the greatest heavyweight of this generation when he hasn't fought most of the heavyweights of this generation. So he's done a tremendous PR job. So yeah, I don't think Tyson Fury is afraid, long story short. It's kind of like Amir Khan with Kell Brook. Was Amir Khan afraid of Kell Brook? No. He was never afraid of Kell Brook. He'd sparred Kell Brook. He'd fought better fighters than Kell Brook. It was really an ego. I guess the best way to describe it is he was afraid of losing to Kell Brook. That's what he was afraid. He wasn't afraid of the man himself. If he was to fight Kell Brook behind closed doors, I don't think he'd hesitate at any point in his career. But losing to Kell Brook was something he was afraid of because he would no longer be the top welterweight in the UK. And with Tyson Fury, I don't think it's so much with Joshua these days. I think he really fancies the Joshua fight now. But then again, it could all change if Joshua looks too good in the Usyk rematch. I think it's more Usyk that he's not sure about. He doesn't quite know how good Usyk is, and therefore he's a bit cautious and he's a bit wary. Because again, he wants to preserve the unbeaten record. You see it. That's my take on what Tyson Fury is doing and how he feels about Anthony Joshua and Alexander Usyk. I mean, even with Dillian Whyte, he could have fought Dillian Whyte a long time before he actually did. He could have fought Dillian Whyte before Whyte got knocked out by Povetkin. Now, what, have we all forgotten about that? Yeah, he could have fought him before the Povetkin fight for the WBC Diamond Belt. Dillian Whyte was up for it. The WBC said that they would do that fight for the Diamond Belt, and Tyson Fury said no, after previously saying he would. He waited for Whyte to get knocked out first before entertaining that particular mandatory. So, was that a case of Tyson Fury being afraid of Dillian Whyte? No, he was never afraid of him, in my opinion. He was never afraid of him, but he saw him as a bigger risk, as a risk that he was only willing to take once the WBC literally forced it on him. And then he went in there and he took care of business. Of course, he took care of business of a guy who'd been knocked out in the meantime, badly. This wasn't the Dillian Whyte who was trying to fight Tyson Fury for the Diamond Belt, So, and I'm talking about in terms of Fury's perception of Dillian Whyte. Yeah, the perception that Fury had of Dillian Whyte, just like everybody else, would have changed after the Povetkin fight. many people who maybe were a little wary of fighting Dillian Whyte would have been much more keen on fighting Dillian Whyte after Povetkin sparked him out. So bear that in mind. Anyway, what else did Jake Paul say? Well, as far as, again, boxing not being able to force fighters to face each other in the same way that UFC does. Yeah, that's true for the reasons I've already explained, but also UFC doesn't allow fighters to be as independent as Jake Paul is. You couldn't have a Jake Paul in UFC. Jake Paul doing his own shows and calling all the shots and fighting who he wants to fight. That's not how it works in UFC. In UFC, you fight who they tell you to fight. You can't become a bigger brand than the UFC itself, which is the opposite of boxing. In boxing, the fighters are bigger brands than the promoters. Yeah, the public are more familiar with the name Canelo than they are with Matchroom. They're more familiar with Jake Paul, right? They're more familiar with Anthony Joshua than they are with Matchroom. Or with Tyson Fury than they are with Queensbury, right? Frank Warren's outfit. So it's the opposite of boxing. And both UFC or MMA and boxing have their strengths and weaknesses, right? A lot of people like to focus on all the weaknesses of boxing. But hey, it depends how you want to look at things. You can look at things as the glass as being half full, or you can look at it as being half empty. Personally, I tend to look at the glass as being half full. Maybe that's just kind of maybe that's just the kind of person I am. So you guys let me know what you think in the comments below about all the points I've raised in this video and what Jake Paul said about Tyson Fury being afraid of Anthony Joshua and Alexander Usyk. And does Jake Paul really believe this? Or is he just trying to hit back at the Fury family because he has beef with the Fury family? I don't mean like real beef, but professional beef because of his, could you even call it a rivalry with Tommy Fury? They haven't even fought in the ring. So yeah, he's kind of going back and forth with the Furies a little bit because of the situation with Tommy Fury. And also, Jake Paul isn't that knowledgeable when it comes to boxing. I know he's a boxer now himself. And, he's pretty good, Jake Paul, for somebody with no experience. He had 2 amateur fights that was also against YouTubers, one or two amateur fights. And he's had a handful of pro fights. For someone with such little experience, he's actually quite good. And that's because of the training he gets. He trains like a professional. He trains with professionals. So he's better than your average novice with so few fights. You see what I'm saying? But at the end of the day, he still is a novice and he doesn't quite have the understanding about boxing that, people who are more steeped in the sport have. Because, for example, he said that nobody knows Bivol, and Bivol's not a challenge for Canelo. Anybody who'd watched Bivol fight, anybody who knew anything about Bivol knew that he was a challenge. They wouldn't have necessarily picked him to win, but they knew that this was a serious fight, and Bivol was a serious fighter. But Jake Paul, in his mind, because nobody knows Bivol, then he must not be any good. He thought that the Charlo fight and the Benavidez fight would have been tougher for Canelo. Whereas I always thought, the toughest challenges for Canelo, always in my mind, were at 175. I thought that the Beterbievs and the Bivols were going to be tougher for him than even fighting Makabu at cruiserweight. So anyway, that's my take on things. Let me know your take in the comments below. If you're tired of the biased narratives and mass censorship on mainstream platforms, and you want to be part of a community of critical thinkers who love free speech just as much as you do, then come and join me on Patreon and access my weekly no-holds-barred, censorship-free podcast where we lift the lid on a wide variety of controversial topics. It's not mainstream friendly, it's not politically correct, but that's the whole point. We dare to stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. Just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called Hatman Hot Topics. You'll gain access to a minimum of 2 hours of exclusive content every single week, including podcasts, videos, interviews, live stream Q&As, as well as my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. Not to mention a vast back catalog of hundreds of hours of previous episodes. You can listen via the Patreon app with the option to download in high quality MP3. We've also got an Element group where you can come and chat and hang out with myself and other members. Unlike Discord, it has full end-to-end encryption, is decentralized, and it's 100% censorship free. You can also send voice notes as well as much larger audio and video files than you can on Discord. So come and sign up on Patreon. There's no contract, there's no commitment. You can cancel at any time, and it's cheaper than a cup of coffee. So I'll see you over there. I'm out.